a series of articles, investigative journalism, on an issue faced by the telecom industry, and that is with these lead-sheathed cables. The Wall Street Journal had identified 2,000 of these cables, or locations where these cables exist. And these have existed, by the way, for well over 100 years, perhaps even 120 years, when the cable industry was in its infancy. But these lead-sheathed cables are overhead as well as under waterways. In fact, the Wall Street Journal had identified 350 of these locations where they're next to bus stops where people congregate. They had also identified something like 65 schools or 64 schools in the state of New Jersey alone, the most densely populated state, where these cables were nearby. When you start combining a health hazard like this with children, it becomes very serious. In fact, members of Congress are asking for executives from the telecom industry to begin to testify on what they knew about this problem and what they're doing about this problem. One of the representatives had indicated that this is corporate irresponsibility of the worst kind. And another one basically said that the cable industry should be cleaning up their problem. The problem is this really is everybody's problem because of the enormity of this problem. How did the Wall Street Journal do this? Well, they did it in a very thorough way, apparently, according to their journalism. They examined these old permits, and we're talking really old permits in boxes, in paper, that extend back from 1940 to 1965. It was in 1965 that the telecom industry had decided to move away from lead-sheathed cables because of the health risk that was then really identified for the public, and that they moved away from that. But they used these permits and digitized this information, and then used basically AI to determine through Google Maps where these locations existed. And then they also used something called an X-ray fluorescent analyzer to help determine where this lead exposure exists. So the integrity of this journalism is probably pretty good. The belief is that probably tens of thousands of telecom workers have been exposed directly to this lead, either through soldering lead cables or splicing lead cables. So tens of thousands of people. And the problem with the exposure to lead is that it leads to neurological problems, kidney problems, cardiovascular problems, gastrointestinal issues. The problems are pretty severe, and actually the pictures in the Wall Street Journal of people alleging that they had been exposed to this lead, workers, is really unfortunate. The telecom industry right now is posturing itself with its communications, indicating that they have science, which they have not really given to the Wall Street Journal, that indicates that they do not believe that these lead cables actually present a health risk to the public. We'll have to see. My analogy there is sort of like Captain Kirk in saying, "Shields up, Mr. Sulu." So we'll have to see. And we'll have to see when the executives go before Congress to testify. The complexity of this problem is really enormous. The EPA, Congress, the Federal Communications Commission, and then talk about state agencies that deal with public health issues. These are really old records, and the Wall Street Journal has admitted that probably many records don't exist of these permits at this point, so the 2,000 locations may be a fraction of the problem. And analysts working for the Wall Street Journal had determined that the cost of resolving this issue right now is about $59 billion. But when you're dealing with a number of that magnitude, who really knows? And then when you begin to try and piece apart whose responsibility for removing for removing these cables and remediating these problems when they were put in place 100 years ago by people who no longer are around, it will become very complicated. When starting an ERM program, I typically tell the executives to start small and to think big, to think very big. And typically we begin with a list of the top 10 risks. And of those top 10 risks, typically the most complicated risks rise to the top. The most costly ones to deal with, to manage, rise to the top. Risk avoidance is a strategy, and accepting risk is a strategy, but ignoring a risk is not a strategy. And the executives from these telecom organizations are going to find out real soon how serious this issue is. And unfortunately, the people who have been exposed to this lead, the workers themselves, already know the first-hand effects of this. So we'll have to see how this develops. But applying these principles to an enterprise risk management program is fundamental, regardless of whether you're in the telecom industry or any other industry. So to find out more about enterprise risk management, check out ermexchange.com.